Welcome to the Ultimate Ukraine channel. The war between Ukraine and Russia is escalating more and more. The Eastern Front has been very active for the last week, and Russia is using its last cards to occupy Bakhmut and defend the Donbas region. On the other hand, the Ukrainian army is sending all its powerful troops to the region to defend Bakhmut. In these days of cold weather, Putin's cruel missiles are hitting the infrastructures of the Ukrainian people, trying to push them into greater darkness. Dozens of missiles have disabled heat and electricity systems across the country, including in Kiev, where 2/3 of its inhabitants lack heating and water. In sub-freezing weather, Russia is launching dozens of missiles and drones into Ukraine's energy systems, trying to trap millions of civilians into cold and darkness in its deadly operation to maul and freeze the population. Even if 90% of these attacks are prevented by the Ukrainian air defense, unfortunately, the remaining 10% is enough to put Ukrainian civilians in a difficult situation. Ukraine, which has increased its power with the air defense systems from the West, still cannot prevent the losses in the civilian infrastructure, as it cannot completely stop Russian attacks. The basis of these attacks carried out by the Russian army on civilian infrastructures is to hinder the ongoing ground attacks of Ukraine by getting stronger. Putin wants to prevent the Ukrainian armed forces from blocking it by diverting the attention of the Ukrainian armed forces after the attacks. Because even in Bakhmut, to which the Russian army directs all its attention, the Ukrainian armed forces are showing a serious resistance against the Russian attacks, while the Ukrainian armed forces are advancing in the direction of Melitopol. We know that when the gates of Crimea are opened, there will be no obstacles in front of the Ukrainian armed forces. Russia is focusing its efforts on offensive operations in the Bakhmut and Avdiivka directions, trying to improve its tactical position in the Kupiansk and Lyman directions. In other directions, the Russian army is defending previously occupied lines. The Russian army focuses its efforts on restraining the actions of units of the Ukrainian defense forces, and at the same time continues to bombard the positions of Ukrainian troops and civilian objects along the line of contact. In general, this is exactly what the Russians do, but the Ukrainian armed forces give the necessary answer to them on the battlefield with 22 airstrikes carried out in one day. Russia continues to suffer heavy losses both in the south and east. It has been confirmed that Ukrainian troops hit Russian personnel and equipment clusters in the southern part of the temporarily occupied Zaporizhia region. They wounded more than 130 Russian soldiers, destroyed up to 10 weapons and various types of military equipment. During the day, the Ukrainian Air Force launched 10 attacks on Russian personnel, weapons and military equipment clusters, and 12 on the positions of enemy anti-aircraft missile systems. Missile and artillery units of the armed forces of Ukraine struck an enemy ammunition depot, 3 command posts and 8 manpower clusters. All of these attacks focus on all Russian targets in the Zaporizhia region before the Melitopol offensive, which we think is prepared by the Ukrainian armed forces. It seems that the Ukrainian armed forces will head towards Melitopol after clearing this area. This prediction is actually clearer when the land and air attacks carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces are examined. It does not seem possible at the moment that the Russian army will be able to counter the Ukrainians in a ground operation. Especially in southern Ukraine, it is seen that the Russian army takes a defensive position. But the surprise support to the Ukrainian armed forces may take them one step ahead of the Russian army in the ground operation. This support comes from the south. Chechen fighters left Syria to fight the Russians in Ukraine. Abdul Hakim al-Shishani, a veteran of the Chechen-Russian War of the 1990s and commander of the Ajnad al-Kavkaz group that fought Syrian government forces in Latakia, arrived in Ukraine with a group of Chechen fighters to fight the Russians. The commander and members of the Chechen-led Islamic rebel group Ajnad al-Kavkaz, operating in northern Syria, reportedly traveled to Ukraine to fight against Russian forces there. Sources from inside the jihadist groups in Syria said that Chechen fighters from Ajnad al-Kavkaz, who were fighting Syrian government forces in rural Latakia, recently arrived in Ukraine from Idlib, where they fought the Syrian government with the opposition. It is seen that Chechen fighters have recently flocked to Ukraine and joined the Ukrainian fronts from both Europe and different regions in order to reverse the war in the region. It is known that the main reason for this movement of Chechen fighters was to light a fire of freedom in their homeland, right after they defeated the Russian army in Ukraine. Chechen leader Kadyrov has actually come to the fore as one of the biggest allies of Russian leader Putin, since the first day of the war, but we have witnessed many times that Chechen fighters have different things to say on this subject. Even in the first months of the offensive, when Chechen battalions stepped into Ukraine, 2 Chechen battalions took the side of the Ukrainian armed forces and showed their stance against Russia. They never forgot the 2 great wars between Russia and Chechnya and how their own soldiers were killed by Russia. The Chechens, who had been waiting for the right time for long years for revenge, got the opportunity and they rushed to the front lines to fight the Russians. It is also true that tensions have increased recently between Chechens and Russians. The conflict between 2 law enforcement officials in Chechnya turned deadly last month and eventually led to widespread repression by the authorities. The fact that Ramazan Kadyrov sided with the conflict raises deeper questions about the lack of Chechen troops in the war in Ukraine. This issue may pose a big problem for the Russian leader. Even though most Chechens support Ukraine, Putin has made a lot of use of Kadyrov supporters, known as Kadyrovites, at the front. 10 days ago, a small argument broke out in the Chechen town of Urus-Martan between a Rosguardian soldier from the Russian National Guard and the local traffic warden. What appeared to be a minor conflict quickly escalated and turned into an all-out attack on citizens who did not support the regime of Ramazan Kadyrov, Chechnya's longtime dictatorial ruler. This is Kadyrov's attempt to show that he has full control over Chechnya, a Russian republic waging an unsuccessful war of independence against Moscow in the mid-1990s. But it is also clear that the refusal of many Chechens to go to war in Ukraine has exacerbated the situation. On the evening of December 11th, in one of the districts of Chechnya, military special forces raided the homes of people who had witnessed the clash between 2 law enforcement officers, which led to the stabbing death of a traffic officer the previous day. Security forces have been present at all entry and exit points and around the city of Urus-Martan for several days. However, these heavily armed officers did not have identification marks on their uniforms as they stopped and checked every car. Kadyrov takes this story even further to show that he has Chechnya under control. Urus-Martan, like other mountainous regions, has always been one of the most opposed to the central authority in the capital of Grozny. The people here have always resisted the Kadyrovites most fiercely, and Kadyrov himself wanted to show people that he could terrorize anyone who criticizes anything, even the actions of a local traffic officer, for example. But this may be to the advantage of freedom fighter Chechens. Freedom fighters are waiting for an opportunity to rebel against Kadyrov and Putin's Russia, and this event could cause even more serious outrage. At the moment, it is stated that Kadyrov has not been able to find soldiers to fight for Russia on the Ukrainian front. How can we imagine sending disgruntled citizens into war on a large scale? However, Kadyrov uses the war in Ukraine as both fear-mongering and another method of fighting any opposition and legalizing the killing of dissidents. He sends Chechens who are against him to the Ukrainian front. But does this work for Putin? We are not sure about that. There was a problem with the fact that since the beginning of the war, both Kadyrov and Vladimir Putin expected Chechnya to enter the war, but Chechnya has not forgotten its recent history. Russia bombed Chechnya in the 1990s to suppress an independence movement. The pain of this is that there are many Chechen citizens who still live very lively all over the republic. Kadyrov and Putin boasted much larger, inaccurate numbers, but in fact more than 3,000 ethnic Chechens have not gone to Russia's war in the past 10 months. Over time, this number dropped significantly due to injuries and deaths. They can't hire new people. Even the poor refuse to work in the so-called civil service, for example the police, because this is easily converted into military service. It is difficult to arrange mass conscription of Chechens to go to war. They can be coerced by the threat of imprisonment and torture, but this requires huge resources, because even if there is an expert on torture in every police force, they must also be followed. At the same time, Kadyrov is aware that the more he resorts to this method, the more threatened his own seat is. Speaking in the midst of the explosion of artillery on the Ukrainian fronts, a masked Chechen soldier said his ultimate goal was to liberate the Russian Republic of Chechnya, a land further east. The hope for Chechens under Ukrainian military command is that a victory in the war will trigger a political crisis in Russia, and with it, the downfall of Kadyrov, which some governments, including the United States, have accused of human rights abuses. When such a situation occurs, it will not only bring the end of Kadyrov, but also the end of Putin. Thanks for watching.